Gabriel Orozco, it's a truism, isn't it, to say needs no introduction. I'm sure his work is familiar to all of you. He is one of the foremost international artists of our age, and we are thrilled to be able to present his work here in Edinburgh. Gabriel came to prominence in the early 90s with perfectly judged interventions in a series of international group shows. I know many of you will be familiar with some of the most iconic images of our time which have been created by Gabriel. He's the artist who brought us La Déesse, the Citroën car chopped down the middle, joined back together. A car that's already an icon, a car that's now doubly an icon because of what Gabriel has done to it, and a symbol, I think, of the contemporary age, of Paris, of everything that an artist, a really good artist, can do with an image. Briony Fer, again well known to us, brought us our Eva Hesser exhibition, then brought us this proposal. And I'm not going to talk too much about this show. I'm going to leave it to Briony to introduce it, but suffice it to say, when Briony came to us and said, I have an idea for a show with Gabriel. Gabriel seems keen to do it in Scotland. What do you think? What do you think we thought? We thought, oh, I think so, yes, please. So, Briony, would you like to kick us off by saying a few words about the show?
Thank you. And hello, everybody. I'm really delighted to introduce the proposition of the show, but I don't want to take up too much of the valuable time, I think, of the discussion that I hope will unfold this afternoon amongst us. But the proposition of the exhibition is an incredibly simple one. I like to think of it as a kind of what-if type question. And I guess that's one of the reasons that I brought it to Fiona at the Fruitmarket, because not many museums and institutions necessarily like what-if type questions as the starting point of an exhibition. And the idea was an incredibly simple one, which was what would it be to take a single work by Gabriel Orozco and think with it rather than kind of about it, and place it at the center of our thinking. In a way, it could have been any of Gabriel's work, because in a way he is known as an artist who makes such a diverse range of things through, drawings, through sculptures, through found objects, and so on. So why I chose a single painting, the Eye of Go, the black and white painting downstairs, I'm not entirely sure why. Partly this exhibition was to figure out why that painting, atypical in a way of his work because it's a painting, had stuck in my mind. But this is not a show putting that painting in context. The point was to, as I say, place it at the center of our thinking and kind of imagine a constellation of the work around it. So not to place it in the context of a chronology, but to see the relationships that could be triggered by it. And as it were, throwing up a pack of cards and seeing how they land. So what we did was then to, I guess, thinking from that starting point, to think what other work from Gabriel's oeuvre we would constellate, if you like, or reconstellate, if I could use that word. And talking at length to Gabriel over quite a long time, we're looking at most of the work in this show, or a large proportion of it, has not been exhibited before. And we looked at a lot of graphic work on paper, and wanted to get that sense of the work that goes into the work, but asking the question, what's the work of the work? What does it do? And specifically, another kind of dumb question, which is about why circles seem to be so much not so much necessarily a conscious preoccupation, but what is it about the circles that seem to be so almost obsessive as a motif or a form or a something within the work, for Gabriel, an instrument. And so to take that simple question, what is it that what circles do? If circles are not forms within a composition, how do they work? How could they be thought of as a kind of instrument? I wanted the show to be a sort of, what would the visual equivalent of thinking out loud be? That's the kind of feeling, the provisional feeling that I hope comes off the show, because the show brings together a lot of work that is, I think, part of, well, hopefully shows something about the materiality, the way in which Gabriel approaches his work. Not all of the work in the show is necessarily finished work or main pieces, but nor is it simply marginal or necessarily, I think, preparatory work. It's not a show about painting, even though a painting is at its heart. But I guess for me, the Eye of Go stuck in my mind for the last several years, because Gabriel did start painting in 2004, or producing paintings. And I guess I've been trying to think through not only how circles work in the work, but what is it about these 2D flat things that don't remain 2D and flat within his work and become somehow not only three-dimensional, but let the world back in. And I guess the whole exercise is to think about how using something as, you know, with such a powerful inner logic as these configurations of circles can actually, far from being something about, you know, the autonomy or what is intrinsic to the surface of painting, is actually the opposite, that flips out and lets the world back inside, you know, that actually opens the work to the work. And the acetates that we are sitting between were, for me, and I think for Fiona too, the great revelation of the show, thinking back to works that Gabriel had done 10 years previously in the mid-1990s, that in some ways are not paintings, but show us something about where these ideas began.
So we've invited Benjamin here, as Stacey said, Gabriel's possibly principal interlocutor, and in a way, the unprivileged outsider here, the visitor to the show. And I would be delighted, Benjamin, if you could share with us your first thoughts.
I've read the catalog, beautiful, fabulous, detailed essay, and I've read it quite carefully, several times by now. And it is a very provocative catalog for me, because the show is very provocative in many ways, because it claims in many ways that we are witnessing the beginning of a new type of abstraction of the like we have never seen before. And for a historian who is a bit of a private detective by nature or by compulsion or by professional default, that is a very provocative statement, because we've seen many moments of abstraction in the last 100 years, all of them always coming up with the same claim, saying we are the real moment of abstraction, the definitive moment, the transformative moment, the moment of change, the moment of utter illumination, the moment of utter dismantling of forms of traditional mythical investment, etc., etc. So abstraction always comes with these great promises throughout the 20th century. And the way you present Gabriel in the exhibition, and in the essay even more, has the same claims, in a sense, that we are witnessing not the legacy of Mondrian, not the legacy of Ellsworth Kelly, not the legacy of Jackson Pollock, not the legacy of Piero Manzoni, but we're witnessing a completely different type of abstraction. So that's a pretty massive proposal that one has to pause about for a moment when one is a historian, or when one thinks the way I do, unfortunately, which is very contextual, limited in its operations, not very visionary, I admit that. So I say, what type of abstraction is this really now? And how is it different from what we've seen before? And the Eye of Go is a great point of departure, because it's really something, when you see it for the first time, you say, what is this? And, or when you see the acetates for the first time, as I did here, I say, what is this? It's not at all convincing me at first sight that this is something of utter importance. It looks like studies, looks like sketches, looks like preparatory work. And then when you look at it, sorry, Gabriel's already getting a little, you know, it's like, It's not compelling to walk into the room and say, this is a great work of art. Not at all, right? It's like something, what is this? This thing? Duchamp? What? Transparency, geometric structures, theoremetric structures. We've seen this all before in one way or the other, in one constellation or the other. We've seen it serialized, we've seen it in various forms of compositional order, we've seen it in relational principles. So all of a sudden there is this strange structure confronting us, and you say, it doesn't even think about the most traditional fallacy of abstraction, which is to become ornament, right? Which is one of the greatest dangers that abstraction has fought for the 100 years of its existence. And that was actually the only criticism that I have in regard to your wonderful essay, that it never touches on the question of why is this not ornament? And why is ornament such a fallacy and such a dangerous structure for abstraction to fall into? And Gabriel really touches on this in a weird way, knowingly, undoubtedly, playingly, undoubtedly, but certainly the threshold to ornament in Gabriel's work is probably stronger than it was in Mondrian's work, I would say. Right? This could easily become something, right? So from there, one has to then ask a whole set of questions, what is happening here? And you answer most of them in the essay brilliantly, like saying, first of all, this is just one aspect of an incredibly complicated apparatus of operations, of instruments working towards something else. And that is, of course, the brilliant dimension of Gabriel's work, that it always directly points into its opposite, right? The wonderful moment in your essay where you say abstraction and abjection come together. That's not something that we know too well. So that's quite striking to see this, or that abstraction becomes an actual object in the world where it functions. These are instantly criteria that you give us to answer most of the questions that I just posed, right? So clearly, the show should be seen as a project, almost like a theoretical preliminary project to understand the work at large, right? And I think that's what it does, because once you've seen this exhibition, the other work becomes even more complex. That's one of the great kind of merits of the show, that you do understand how the work is about triggering processes, right? So when we say that, and Gabriel, I hope you will contradict me if I say something that's wrong, but if I follow Briony's argument that your type of abstraction is an abstraction that triggers a process, then instantly, once again, I come back with a historical argument and say, okay, well, artists have tried that. Richard Serra has triggered process in the 60s, very major ways, right? And there was an abstraction in the late 1960s that was very engaged in dismantling morphologies and science systems of abstraction in favor of pure processual initiation, right? But that's not the same thing either. That's very interesting, right? So it's not about making lead melt or making gravity evident, if we want to call two examples of that moment. That is not the type of process that Gabriel triggers. So I'm asking, what type of process is he triggering? And then it becomes a bit cloudy for me. And then the skepticism comes back, and I say, okay, is it really possible to initiate with the module or the morphology of the circle? Is it really possible to trigger off a kind of libidinal intensity of liberation or a libidinal intensity of countering reification in the spectator? You don't really say that, but it seems like that is a subtext of what you're saying, that there is an initiation to an immediacy that the abstraction generates that allows us to recognize the world as something that is in flux, in transformation, in change, in production, in constitution. I'm not sure, I hope to be corrected if these definitions are wrong, but that seems to be somewhat the subtext of your argument, that this work initiates some type of immediacy in the spectatorial experience that transcends normative categories, traditional paradigms, and allows us something that goes beyond parameters of pre-established forms of experience. Right? Would you agree with that? Is it fair to say it in those terms?
I wouldn't call it an immediacy.
Okay.
I mean, I would think of it as disruptive in some ways to those conventional protocols that attach to certain forms of, picture making.
Right.
But I think there is something intensely bodily about it. Mm-hmm. I don't think being bodily means that they're more immediate, obviously. I think that's charged and mediated. But in a way, yes, I do want to make a kind of bodily claim for them.
That's what I thought you were saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
But how is it different from a phenomenological claim in minimalism, for example, which was also making that claim?
Yeah.
In where? In what?
In minimalism.
I think it's the opposite of a kind of reductive process.
Okay.
I think that there's a sense in which, to me, and this is part of what I've found interesting in Gabriel's work, is that for all my interest in kind of minimalism and post-minimalism and so on, in some ways those models of American modernism and postmodernism are strangely inadequate to deal with this. And
I agree.
in some ways,
Totally. Yeah.
it is another form of process. As you say, those are not quite good enough, or they're just not sufficient, they're just different. And in some ways, and I discuss a little bit about Lydia Clark, not because she's an influence, but just because there's a relationship, and here I kind of disagree, I guess, with the idea that I want to totally, deracinate them from the legacies of earlier artists, because in one sense, although I don't want to see them as the product of those legacies, I do want to see them as in some kind of relationship with the legacies of geometric abstraction that in some ways have nothing to do with minimalism, with Judd's minimalism, for example, but have, in some ways, I think Gabriel once talked a bit in these terms, being more interested in leapfrogging over those kind of, mid-century North American models. And so much more interested in the kind of geometric abstraction, which, for all the fact that Judd and so on, André, use modular elements, has very little to do, arguably, with the legacies of constructivism, for example. So I was kind of interested in that what those relationships might mean, but without seeing these as simply a kind of this work as a continuation of those utopian models, which I absolutely don't think it is. But nor do I think that these circles or these kinds of configurations have simply now, at the end of the last millennium, become empty kind of receptacles, empty signifiers. I don't want to exaggerate a kind of revolutionary transformation, but I think Gabriel is one of, that not single-handedly, but what I think is interesting is to try and reconfigure a model that looks to a future rather than simply, melancholically replays earlier versions of abstraction, which in some ways is, seems to me important to do. And I think in relation to the grid, for example, you could think of the work as not just breaking away from the grid entirely, but jostling or in some kind of friction or in some kind of conflict with the grid, not overcoming it. But if you see the grid as the paradigmatic trope within modernism, which has been incredibly tenacious through the 20th century, there's something in the work that circles do that actually demand a slightly different way of thinking, it seems to me. So I am interested in those continuities, but I think, that demand on us, your question, these are not, the question, what is this, seems to me absolutely the question I would demand of a work of art that is very significant as opposed to insignificant. That would be the single question that I think would guarantee some, at least, not that there's a direct equivalence, but that would signal to me that actually these are more than just some work that goes alongside, even
so
though
that
I'm
way
not
that
sure
I
what
posed
they
it,
are.
I hope it was clear that that's the way that motivated my question.
Absolutely.
Like standing in front of a Manzoni for the first time in 1961, saying, what is this? Right? When you know all the conventions of abstraction at that moment were completely ruptured, completely concluded, and something else began, which we have no terminologies for at the time, but we call it some type of continuity of abstraction. But of course, it was a fundamental change of all the parameters with which abstraction had operated for 50 years by that time, right? And I think something similar is happening in this work when you say, what is this, right? I mean, is it possible to follow on your wonderful proposal in the text to fuse Duchamp and Mondrian, which is no small claim, once again, to make. I'm not even sure whether Gabriel says that himself or you suggested it to him and he said, indeed, that's what I would like to do. Perhaps we can hear Gabriel about that for a moment.
Welcome to my show. Very welcome. I was having such a good time until now. So pay attention for it. Well, I think one of the reasons why I was enthusiastic about doing this exhibition is because Briony wanted to put questions on the table, not so much to give any affirmation of a kind of grand statement of this is in bigger scale, I don't know, a possible future for something. It was more like an exploration of a kind of abstraction that I also don't like to call it abstraction just like that, because the word abstraction is also so big and flexible, and we have so many different types of works in the same basket of abstraction that they are so different. And we should not forget that at some point was a discussion about calling it abstraction or concrete art. And I think that's an important discussion that is over, but it was at the very early stages of abstractionism. Many people was calling concrete art, which is more like reality, more like this is factual, this is an object, this exists, this is tridimensional body, and not abstraction, which looks like more like a diagram or a kind of illusion of color, right? So I think that discussion is pertinent, although it's not happening anymore. But I think we should be careful with the word abstraction, because abstraction is such a big word. But then I think those are, what Briony's intention to bring together this work that I will, is a show that I will never do myself like this. Is her selection, her idea, her hypothesis. Is this not as a statement of, it's more like a exploration of this perhaps way of abstracting our times, or abstracting the way we see, or I see the world, and having work of labor over the years in doing these diagrams, these intersections, these structures, these blockings through color and black ink in white paper as a way of expressing or dilucidating a system of how things work, how I behave in a space, how I build up a sculpture, how I install things, how I perceive the landscape. So I think that all those questions were that I was working in with real objects, using a car or a yogurt cup or a shoebox, oranges, or taking photographs. I was also doing it a bit on the underground, or let's say in the backstage, doing these drawings over the years. And I think that Briony's interest in putting this together as the backstage work coming suddenly into light, and not having the classic works that people know and the iconical, they call it iconical, whatever, But just this kind of research that was in my notebooks from the very beginning, and these were rolled in my closet for 20 years. So to have this out and see it on its own, it was already for me something that was, well, new for me, but also will place questions like in a way that could be interesting, and also to motivate for new works or to look at it in a different way. So for me, to reduce, I mean, I remember, for example, an anecdote with Ann Tompkins came to see some of the paintings I was doing in 2006. And with the first question, the first thing she told me, like, she was trying to think in what reference will have this work, and she couldn't think in anything. She told me that sincerely, out of like, the funny thing is that I don't know what to do with this work, but I cannot also relate it to anything else. I don't know what will be the genealogic tree of this work. You can obviously go to Mondrian a little bit, to Duchamp if you want, but it's not the answer. You know it's not the answer. Even though you can think that looks like Mondrian, or looks like Duchamp, or looks like Rodchenko or Manzoni, you know immediately that that is not the answer, that that is not important at the end. So you place the question, but I think, honestly, you got the answer immediately. That will not solve the problem. That is not going to give you the answer of what to do with this. So I don't place that question anymore. I feel like, whatever. I mean, it looks like this or that. I think it's something about how they are useful for me probably in a very subjective way also. I mean, they are kind of rational, geometrical, but there is a degree of intuition in just trying to do this without knowing exactly what for, but something that comes back and becomes a system on its own, almost like doing a kind of exercise that helps my brain to keep fluid and agile and working, although I can be probably thinking in cutting a car or collecting dust in the street. But in the moment to make a drawing, because I need to sit in a desk to think what I'm doing, I'm not drawing myself collecting dust or drawing myself cutting a car. It's not, it's not the drawing representation of my work. It's also not a drawing that is a sketch of possible work. So there are studies, but there are studies about what? Probably there are studies about awareness, perception, concentration, exercise in the essential sense of the word as an exercise. You are exercising your brain doing this. Almost like when you sing in the shower, or you're singing in the shower, something like that. But on the other hand, when they are exposed as final works, like the case of this exhibition, the question I'm still asking is what is going to generate in the public. I mean, this is the first time we are looking at these guys that were in the closet for 20 years. I wonder what people will think of this after. Yeah, so, what I also think is interesting in the exhibition is that it's not trying to justify these works in relation with the other major works or known works. It's trying to justify this work on its own as a process on its own, and try to elucidate why it could be interesting for us to witness this process. Because maybe it was more like a background, underground process, and suddenly is on the first plane to be watched as a work on its own. Also for me, it was interesting to think in what will people think that they don't know so much the other works, and they come and see this, and they recognize the artist that does circles, and it's the only thing he does maybe. That people might think that just this is the guy, this is the only thing he does, this guy. And if, I don't know, Daniel Buren does just stripes, or Neil Toroni does just brushes in the same, because I said, why not? The only thing I do is circles. You can make a career out of this.
You'd make a pretty good career out of it.
But it's a joke, obviously. But I mean, if I am an artist that has all this variety of element and materials and medias and all that, and suddenly a show like this became so specific and so constrained in this system. For me, I was curious to see how people will relate to these things in this way, and that is an interesting process on its own. It was for me to work with Briony and Fiona, and that's why you see I'm not sure. I mean, we can discuss referential. I mean, it's like I was talking with Briony. Abstractionism today, after 100 years, and we could say that abstractionism is probably one of the greatest inventions in art in the last 100 years. But today, you have an encyclopedia of abstraction. You can easily go to many references, and in the moment you stain a paper with some kind of color or something, you can go to the encyclopedia of abstractionism, and there will be somebody who did something like that in the last 100 years. So it's funny because abstractionism is already almost like part of the reality of language, mythology. It's not abstract anymore. It has its own reality. And you have this, you can see it in the books, and everything you do abstract will have that reference. But the question is why we need to do a different type of abstractionism, or let's call it abstract because it's not a phase, but this geometric, why we need abstractionism as a system to represent or to think or to express or to elucidate the way we see the world today, which is not the same way we saw the world 100 years ago. So what are the differences between the use of abstraction today? How can be used? How can be relevant? How can be an instrument? And because we still use it. And you have very good examples like Richter. I don't know if you know him. But how he's using abstraction today. Why is relevant to do that? Not just in relation with abstractionism itself in the history of art, but as a perception of reality. And I think that the reason I started to do these silly circles in my notebooks, and I was thinking why I'm doing this, but I just keep doing it, was perhaps because my brain was perceiving and in the search of this type of structural thinking to analyze all the other elements that I was working in reality through photography, installation, and objects in general. And during from 92 until 2002, which is 10 years, I never did or show that much this work. Then suddenly I decided to do it with the light box, which is downstairs, and some paintings. And I applied in the Atomist also. It would work as a collage. I show it as an object, industrial, mechanically produced. And then in 2004, I decided to present it as paintings on its own, as a form that will try to behave as a structure in a kind of independent way, not applied to ready-made collage or just the drawing as a study, but try to be a finished work. And we have the painting down there is the prototype painting. So to have it there and see what happens with that. It will work as a sculpture, as a flat mobile. It will work as a window abstraction or as a geometric abstraction. It will work as a mechanical representation of some kind of a structure. It will be the beginning of something. All those questions I wanted to ask when I decided to show them as paintings. So that's why I don't think it's about a big statement that this is the new direction of abstraction. It's not any claim like that. I don't feel it like that. I think it's more the question of Briony is if this is a system that is different from others, that is, it obviously have connections with other, like Duchamp, Mondrian, and many others, but that is a system that is unique because it works for this artist in his perception or structuring of the behavior of the sculpture, the installation, and the world. And I think that is a valid question. because also makes you think why it was not done before. Why it's not exactly like it was before? Why these are different? Why they trigger new processes for other things? Why or how this system of thinking and structuring in bidimensional graphics, how this jumps into becomes a car cut in two, a shoebox, a spume floating in the air, or whatever, or a whale with the drawing. So how that happens. And I think that is what, I thought that was a good idea, to analyze the work like this as the beginning of things, beginning of something. The jump after is hard to describe, but at least you have the beginning of some things here, and then you see, we will see. What do you think about that, Briony Fer?
Well, I think I think that's a very good answer,
Or
Gabriel.
you think, or you have another, or you think it's not enough, it doesn't explain also, it's not answering?
No, it explains and answers a lot, but it doesn't answer the question, which I'm not sure that I asked it even, but I might as well ask it now. What does it do for the audience? How do you assume that that is the moment where the audience, this audience or any other audience of your work in general, is in a historical state where that type of structure communicates exactly the way you want it to communicate? Right? There have been many moments in the history, and I'm not asking for morphological explanation.
The Mondrian moment, you remember we were looking together at that? Are you going to mention that?
Yeah.
For example? The grid?
Yeah.
Sorry, that's all.
That's okay. No, there have been many moments in history when abstraction kind of came to its own conclusions and re-established a new object relationship, either in design or in architecture, for example, or in production, which are key moments in the history of abstraction. And if I follow Briony's argument, and quite convincingly so, she says that your work has this incessant relationship to the object world, which it does, which makes it even more compelling, right? Mm-hmm. But what type of object world is that, on the other end, right? With Mondrian, you know the end of the object world will be emancipation, right? With Duchamp, the end of the object world will be a total form of radical annihilation of aesthetic traditional principles. With your work, I can say that the end of the abstraction as it leads into the object world leads into a very complex object experience as well, that is not utopian, it's not productivist, it's not design, right? It's not architectural. It's a very complex object that is often determined by reification, often determined by destruction, often determined by residual ephemeral quality. It's a very peculiar type of object world that your abstraction leads us back into. You called it abject, which I think is a very accurate description. So it's not at all the grand trajectory of abstraction leading into a new transformation of object experience. That I think is an interesting aspect as well. And so I'm saying, does the spectator follow you in this, in terms of saying, yes, this is a type of embodiment that corresponds to my actual experiences in the everyday world as well, right? You have reasons to criticize Kelly and Sarah, for example. Why, right? You say these are embodiments that are historically invalid, right? They don't speak to us anymore, right? There's a certain claim that they've made that doesn't, for example, let's say Sarah, the great figure of the 60s, even though probably would be better to say Eva Hesse, but that, then we get entangled, and it would be fantastic to make that comparison. These are object relationships that they constructed, which are clearly not our object relationships anymore. And why not? Because Sarah, for example, operates completely outside of the world of control of consumption, right? He pretends that we have access to pure phenomenological structures. We have access to pure, almost scientific forms of materiality, right? That's something you will never accept anymore, because you claim you say, if I read you correctly, my experience is infinitely more messed up, complicated, right? I don't have a pure scientific model of experience.
Right.
You have a model of experience that is permeated by reification of everyday life as much as it is permeated by a desire for chance transformation, as much as it's permeated by a new establishment of a type of bodily immediacy. So these are very complicated mixed forms or confused or fused forms that you produce that are very different from the generation of the 60s.
But wouldn't you, I would say in response to that, I mean, you've talked yourself, I think, about the fragile conditions of object experience,
Right.
and I see this as entirely, you know, in a way, playing those kinds of fragile conditions out, playing them out, but also, I think in the work, saying something about it. So
Right.
there is something also self-reflexive going on there. But I think the object world that's being engaged with or related to is so fundamentally different from that world that Sarah and so on inhabited, where in a way the kinds of movements and flows had to do for sure with commodification and consumption. But I think, you know, without wanting or being on kind of precarious ground and making vast generalizations, I do think in terms of the kind of shifts in digital technologies or the kind of flows and movements that we as subjects now experience and live are so qualitatively different from those of the 1960s and that period. And whilst this work in no way kind of, you know, illustrates that, that's one of the reasons I think you need to have a kind of different way of thinking what things that in a way are objects, material objects, mean under the, you know, sign of digitization. And in some ways that is, I wouldn't like to use the word reference, but the fact that the work does deploy digital programming at the same time as incredibly, you know, handmade, artisanal techniques seems to me to play through the whole range, in a way, of labor processes, as well as processes of cognition and understanding those processes. So I guess I think, rather than to come back to the point you raised at the beginning, that I don't actually engage with the problem of the danger of decoration, is that I don't think that now our problem, or the problem of art, or the problem of abstraction, even if this were abstraction, is that of decoration. I mean, I think that was a very historically driven modernist anxiety. I think in a way, if there were a danger or anxiety, it would be the kinds of movements and flows, not of the collapse into decoration, but the collapse into, you know, logos, brands, the way in which, you know, logos spread across the world in the same way, and that kind of, you know, globalized branding.
I do worried about decoration and ornament. I think that that's a problem, especially with circles. I mean, circles, one of the skepticism with circle is just that it's such an easy, spotty, stupid thing, you know? I mean, rationale is a square, triangle is mystical, circle is just like spotty. And I'm very worried that obviously they look like spotty decorative paintings, I mean, you know? So I am worried about that.
That's interesting. Well,
I mean, you know, I think that
I
when
have
you
no
are,
worry about that.
but
Absolutely.
what I am saying, I mean, is that I think that for me, probably doing this and knowing these possible problems, they have to be this type of work, in my opinion, if they can place themselves in between all these problems and function as exactly without getting into they talk about ornamentation, I think they do, but they are not ornamental. They talk about probably beauty, but they are not, you cannot call them beautiful. They talk about some kind of pseudo-scientific research, but you cannot call it, which is the other problem, will be the pretensions of scientific, big-time scientific research through abstraction or something like that. They are silly, but they look somehow experimental. They are serious, but they are not solemn. They are not like. So I think that that's why I guess I was trying it and trying it and trying it, just trying to escape of all these things. So trying to put them in the center of the turbulences that generate just to step in the waters of abstraction, and especially using form which is complex, very complex, very familiar, as bases, bowls, ventilators, and lightings are circular. In everyday life, we see circles all over, but not that much in art, somehow. Nowadays, a bit more, but for a long time, circle was a shape that was mostly avoided by abstractionism, in a way.
Really? Cercle carré?
Unless you get too planetary, right? Or you get too kind of, you know. But I think in general, I will say that circle could be a problem. We know that, and in many ways. Mystical, obviously, when it gets too mystical, as a symbol of the absolute or the neutral or the, symbolic kind of circle in the mystical sense is also dangerous. So obviously using this, and you have all these problems to avoid or to don't get trapped by this. Not just the decorative or the ornamental, but the mystical, the scientifical, even the industrial, and the silly and mechanical, and the esoteric, and the optical. I mean, not easy.
I know.
So,
Well, one of the things I was thinking was when you said, Gabriel, that, there's this encyclopedia of abstraction because it's 100 years old, and, you can look up, I take your point, there's a stain, you can find a stain, you can, they can be treated like motifs, like a kind of little dictionary of symbols, the different kind of abstract forms. But, that's actually not a great way to think about what we generally call, for all its problems, kind of abstract work. But for all the fact that abstraction's 100 years old, there are very few ways of thinking about it, actually, because I know in different contexts it varies, but it's not only the square, but anything that is kind of a geometric form, say, the kind of cultural baggage that comes with it, that it's in some way mechanical and rational because it's drawn with a compass. I mean, I think within certainly, history of art, there's a sense, and certainly within kind of maybe Anglo-American traditions in particular, that certain kinds of, geometric abstraction have to do with the machine aesthetic. There is that kind of immediate connotation, and I guess one of the things that your work, it's not the only work that doesn't do it, this is absolutely not a machine aesthetic, and there's the kind of organicism about it with the kind of molecular or those kinds of chains of association, but also I think just the way in which, the circle is not a form because it morphs quickly into a sphere and it rotates, or it morphs into a bubble, or it morphs into, foam. So it kind of, or here, it kind of undoes itself, it decays. So in some ways, I think what this work does is in some way unsettle certain conventional ways of just, the knee-jerk reaction to, hey, that's Maholinage, that's machine aesthetic. It might be a way of thinking again about that history because, of course, Maholinage was interested in a kind of organic way of thinking about abstraction, actually. But I think in some ways, for all the fact that it's 100 years old, it's quite surprising that the vocabulary is really very limited. And actually, it's limited to the idea that this is a form, and how do you find another word for a form and a composition? And if this isn't that, it's actually, you find yourself kind of still coming back to those words. So in some ways, I think it's really quite problematic to call this stuff abstract at all, because I take your point, it's kind of not. But to ignore the legacies of those ways, means of art making through the 20th century is also not to get much further with trying to find a new set of terms, a new kind of language to describe what's going on there.
I mean, also, I mean, the other thing, and you know, we have talked about it. This abstraction is such a Western world. I mean, for Indians, I mean, India, their work is not called abstract. When you say tantric painting, it's not abstract. I mean, it's an instrument. It's an image to be read, to be chant upon, to follow as you are reading a text. Japanese, I don't know.
Are these traditions easily accessible to us as Western spectators, or you as a Western artist? Can we claim those without exoticizing the whole project?
Well, I think, I mean, well, how important was Japanese art for all 19th century painters and Europeans? I mean, I think that a high degree of abstraction or conception of or perception of the plane, the landscape, the structuring, the geometric structuring of perspective and composition in painting is coming from Japan, from Japanese prints and all that. So it's for sure has had an impact. The different way of abstraction, let's call it abstraction of reality, the landscaping, the composition that Japan has an impact in architecture and in painting. And I think, so how exotic is that? I don't think it's exotic anymore. I think nowadays even more. I think there is the...
It's a train.
It's a train, or it sounds like an airplane. I will say that it's exotic if you want it to be exotic. I mean, if you don't want to see that and just like that, it's not important. It's exotic. It's far away. But there is. So what happened today? I mean, if I claim, which is true, that there is an influence of Indian art in my work in general, which it is, and how important, how easy to analyze that, how relevant is that? It's not what it is. So, I mean, how about circular forms in pre-Hispanic Aztec art? We do have a lot. I mean, the biggest sculpture.
But that's the one you never want to accept as a reference at all.
No, I don't. I never say that. I mean, I can accept that for sure. It's part of it. I mean, you know, the calendar, Aztec calendar is a big circle, full of stuff. But but also the wheels of the cars are circular. So I think you see, it's like, I think that it is true. That, or what? You think it will be too difficult to
I
connect?
think the problem that we are confronting, if it is a problem at all, is to what degree can discursivity and initial authenticity be reconciled in this conversation, right? Because Briony's text is basically giving you a whole spectrum of motivations and operations and achievements that are largely constructed outside of the question of what has recently happened in artistic production, right? There are references to history that you make, but basically you claim this is a type of work that transcends, that departs, that detaches itself, that has no longer anything to do with the type of reductivism, that has nothing to do with the critical interventions of the 60s, that has nothing to do with the moments of reducing pictorial structures like Daniel Buren, since you mentioned him, to the threshold of institutional critique. We are looking at a totally different set of parameters, which is wonderful and very interesting as a challenge. And I come back simply for the sake of the conversation to say, well, how easy is it to do that? To say none of this relates to us anymore, right? When I read Briony about your drawings, but the operations of graphite, what comes to mind, for example, is one of my absolute favorite models of drawing. The late Michael Asher did a series of drawings where he drew graphite on a piece of paper as long as it absorbed the graphite. And it built up on this little square with radius corners, and it built up and it built up and it built up, and you had this incredible velvet layers of endless accumulations of graphite on a small piece of radius cornered paper. Right? To me, that is the ideal drawing of the 1960s and 70s. That's a moment when I say, okay, this is where drawing is, right?
Okay.
And I know this is a very complicated and problematic way of thinking, this kind of saying there's a terminality or terminal moment in certain operations beyond which you have to start all over again. Or you have to, when you transcend them or go beyond them, you have to come back with new arguments, which you do, right? But so reduction, critical negation, critical reflection on the institution, critical reflection on the status of the commodity of the work of art, none of this is operative anymore all of a sudden. And that's when I say, okay, where are we? What is the milieu? What is the ideological spectrum? What is the field within which this operates? Right? This type of abstraction. And what type of liberation, what type of aesthetic experience, what type of emancipation does the work then generate in the audience?
I don't know if you remember the same. The same way I do remember, or you, Briony, what is your perception? But I remember very well how drawing in the early 90s was almost like a non-existence. Mm-hmm. When you remember in the early 90s, everything was about video and photography. Also was very little about painting. There was a lot of installation and things, but drawing also was in a crisis. So we can say, and it's interesting because it's like, why there was no interest in drawing so much? Why it was not the time for thinking about drawing? Obviously, people was drawing. I was drawing these things. I didn't show them. I was doing it for me. So drawing was an intimate kind of process. Almost not like to be public somehow, because the transition to make some ideas public was through photography. I didn't use video, but video was super hot, and installation, etc. So it's true what you say. So there are moments in which drawing or a graphic expression of sorts that has a moment, let's say, that probably solves the problem of that generation or that decade or the issues of that time, you know, as the Michael Asher drawing and probably some of Richard Serral drawings and things like that. So I guess, and I cannot think who will be the 80s drawing that will define the 80s, I don't know. Certainly the 90s, my position was, yes, I was drawing. They were not so visible, but I was doing it. I was doing it in my notebook. I was spitting on paper. I have all these series with this grid, and I wanted to collapse the grid. I somehow was tired of this idea of the grid, tired of minimalist drawing, and kind of calculated, precise, pristine merchandise. And mostly drawing was always at the back of the exhibition. So a lot of galleries, you have a big show, big paintings or sculptures, and then at the very back, the little drawings, almost like souvenirs that you can buy. The status of drawing was problematic as object, as media. And I remember this was, I think, it was kind of almost like unconscious or subjective reaction at the drawing as a kind of intimate process on its own, independent of the others. Photography that I was using in installation, but on its own as a system, how to make a system, drawing a system again, and that helps to instrumentalize ideas, to express the notions that I was trying to research and other things. So I think that the grid was questioned immediately in the spitting that I have there in some books. This is spitting on the grid, and after the spitting, I was with toothpaste, and I was then drawing the kind of sequence of bubbles splash in the grid. So it was the idea of puddle was important to me. The puddle as an accident on the urban grid. That's why I did the wheel prints on bicycle, and you have some puddles here and some puddles there. So the idea of the accident, the idea of the question in the grid, and chance operations. But well, that was not enough, because it was not enough just chance operations like John Cage drawings are not very good, I think. So there was something about rationalization. Axle, not so much the grid, but the axle, the gravity, the structure that joins is not bubbles, it's not just circles as floating, but there are circles as body parts that connect. And all that, I think, was somehow in my research in using drawing. And I think the first time I showed drawings was in 95, 96, something like that. But I remember quite clearly how drawing was not discussed or not shown in the early 90s. So that would be my answer. So I think that was Yeah, drawing an abstraction, if we call it abstraction, has the moments in which they engage with their time and they have to represent and express all the things happening around. And I think that's perhaps what Briony was trying to show in this exhibition.
Briony, we started with abstraction.
Yeah.
I think we still haven't answered the question of whether we're looking at abstraction or not. Drawing and abstraction and drawing.
I mean, I think that the most interesting moments in the history of abstraction are the moments when it stops believing in its own mythology of transcendence. And there is absolutely no way in which I would want to see this in terms of a history of abstraction that's about ideal, pure, transcendent forms. And I think this isn't the first moment, but I think it's a significant moment that actually is embedded in the middle of the 1990s, in which the mythologies of transcendence of certain kind of forms of geometric abstraction is actually put in question in a fairly dramatic way. And I think the claims that I was trying to make in the essay are a little bit more modest than, in that I was trying in part to query at least the version of the 90s that we have. I know it's kind of early days, but you know, that seems to me to be quite a different way of thinking about the 90s, a different way of thinking about, say, how drawing might function in relation to those questions. And not so much, certainly not your take on Gabriel's work of the mid-90s, but certainly other versions of it, you know, the nomadic, the kind of way in which installation or relational aesthetics have become the kind of style labels of that decade. It seemed interesting to me as a question, and this was taken from Gabriel's notebooks, in which there are these kind of mentions of Mondrian in, you know, in the same kind of conjunction as dust and so on. Yeah. What is that to do that in the middle of the 1990s? That is to actually dramatize certain, you know, problems around that. And I just felt that that was a starting point for me to start kind of rehistoricizing that decade, I suppose. And from the other point of view, not so much, we've talked a little bit about the, you know, tracking it back to through the early 20th century, but you're absolutely right that there is a context for this, and it's maybe, you know, it needs to be explicit. And I guess the mythologies that I'm writing this or thinking about this work through now, that I see to be dangerous or I have anxieties about, are, because I think we are in a kind of crisis now, are the mythologies around painting, about a kind of return of certain forms of expression, certain forms of authenticity, you know, almost a kind of, you know, we've talked about this, but you know, kind of magic that seems to me really mystificatory. And it's not only belonging to painting, it for sure, but there is a kind of, you know, return to painting in a way that I have nothing against. You know, I'm very interested in painting, but I felt that this was a kind of quite a good moment to raise some of those questions, because, you know, it is in danger, it seems to me, of just, you know, going back to those same old cliches.
It's very clear to me that the three of you have been talking about Gabriel's work, thinking about Gabriel's work for years, incredibly intelligently and articulately, and we have been privileged to have a little slice, an hour slice of what's obviously a very long conversation. I hate to draw it to a close. I would like to listen all night, but I am going to. So can we take just a minute, take a moment, as Brian and I keep saying, take a moment to thank the three of you and to just think about how extraordinary it is to be privileged to hear you thinking. You talk about the show as something that maybe allows you to think aloud. I think we've all been very privileged to hear you thinking this afternoon. Thank the three of you so, so much. Can we have a big clap, please?
Thank you.